So good evening, everyone, and welcome to this session of Israel Rundown dealing with the Iranian threat. My name is Yoav Limor. I'm a TV commentator dealing mainly with defense and TV host. And with me today are three leading experts here in Israel and abroad. Major General retired Jacob Amidror, a senior researcher at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategic Studies and former national security advisor to the Prime Minister of Israel, as well as the head of the National Security Council about 10 years ago. Dr. Shira Efron, a senior visiting fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies here in Israel, and a special advisor on Israel Rand Corporation, and Professor Avi Ben-Zvi, Abraham Ben-Zvi, the winner of the Israel Prize in Political Science and International Relations for 2020, and the leading commentator in the Israeli media, both printed and electronic, mainly on Israeli American and Mediterranean issues. Thank you so much for the three of you for joining me. Let's deal with Iran. It's been constantly on the news on a daily basis, but mainly in the last weekend. And before we jump into the nuclear issue, I want to ask you, General Amidror, I'll start with you. We've seen an Iranian or allegedly Iranian attack on an Israeli-owned vessel in the Gulf a couple of days ago. What does it mean? Does Iran start a frontal war, open war against Israel and Israelis around the world?
First of all, good evening from Israel. It's only noon in the United States. I want to mention that I am also a member of GINSA Gemander Center in DC. It is a very interesting question. First of all, it's probably the Iranians. We don't know. No one took responsibility, but from all the character of the event, probably it's Iranian. And then the question is, what does it mean? First of all, it's signaling to Israel that the Iranians feel still that they owe Israel for its operation that they believe Israel did, although nobody took a responsibility for. The assassination of the head of the nuclear program in Iran, and they say that they will retaliate. And I think that it is also something which is connected very much to the efforts of Israel to contain the Iranians in Syria. And that was a successful attempt by the Israelis for a long time, since the end of 2012. And the Iranians didn't find an answer to the very successful kinetic attacks of the IDF Air Force. And I think it's a combination. The Iranians need something to show that they can retaliate. And that might be a strong signal to Israel. Be careful, we have means around the world and you will suffer from our operations. They try to lead a terror attacks on Israelis and Americans around the world. America because of the assassination of Soleimani, Israel because of the assassination of Fakhrizadeh, but they didn't succeed. And here in the Gulf of Oman, it's very easy. The Gulf is very close to Iran. Operationally, it's a very easy place to play for the Iranians. Israel is far away. We cannot be everywhere all the time. So for the Iranians, it's a very easy target. Although it is not under an Israeli flag at all. The owner of the ship is an Israeli, but the The vessel itself is not an Israeli one, and it was not into Israel. They were in their way from Saudi Arabia to Singapore, not connected at all to Israel. But yes, it's a strong signal of the Iranians, guys. Be careful. We have our means and capabilities, and it will find you some way, somewhere in the world.
Yes. So Sheila, I wanna add you to this conversation and ask you. General Amidor mentioned the both assassinations of Qasem Soleimani at the beginning of 2020 and Mohsen Fakhrizadeh at the end of last year. But it's wider than that, because we've seen thousands of alleged Israeli attacks in Syria and other places against mainly Iranian targets, and it's part of it seems as part of that war that Israel has been punching the Iranians over and over and over again, and the Iranians have been trying to find somewhere to retaliate. They have been unsuccessful here in Israel, so they find, as General Amidor said, an easy target, a soft stomach to hit in the Gulf of Oman.
Yes, thank you, Limor, and thank you all for having me here. I'll just say that I know IAC, I've been to events before in person, and I wish we could be in person now. I moved back to Israel a year ago from beautiful Los Angeles, and I miss it very much. So thank you for having me. Yeah, I agree with Yaakov Amidor completely on this. This is an easy target, and probably is a way to signal that Iran can retaliate. But as was mentioned, the vessel itself was hurt, but no personnel were hurt. So this is also a very unique way of doing this. We retaliate, but we don't cause too heavy of a damage. The jury is still out and there's still investigation, but I think it's also interesting that it's a maritime attack. One of the agreements, one of the first manifestations of the normalization agreements between Israel and the UAE is to revive the Katsa agreement, the shipment of oil from the Gulf through Israel, and Iran has expressed its objection to the normalization agreement. This could be also another signal. But as you said before, and I think it's not even alleged Israeli attack, the commander of Israeli Air Force and Israeli officials have admitted that Israel attacked thousands of times in Syria primarily. On Iraq, this was a little bit Israel doesn't take responsibility for those, but this proxy war that's no longer such proxy because you have now Iranians on Israel's borders has been going on for a long time. And unfortunately, I'm sure we're going to get to this, it seems that despite different strategies and approaches to contain it, Iran continues its behavior in the region, right? Even the maximum pressure approach of sanctions enacted by the Trump administration that maybe had marginal effect, but they didn't hurt the core interest of Iran in the region, and it didn't hurt their core abilities to try and strike Israel. And this is very concerning, I think.
Yes. So Professor Ben-Zvi, on to you. There has been a switch in the administration in Washington a month ago, and obviously the Iranians are aware of that, and that influences the way they decide to react. We saw a couple of hours ago their decision not to join a supposed meeting with the Americans dealing with the JCPOA. We'll touch that in a minute. But when they decide to attack an Israeli target or an Israeli-owned ship in the Gulf, do they take into consideration that it's Biden and not Trump, and what the Americans will or will not do?
Oh, absolutely. I think that there's another perspective which merges and reinforces what Shira Efron and General Amidor said. Namely, I think that Iran is basically probing the Biden administration. Maybe you can call it saber rattling. You can call it an effort to check and to examine what are the limits of the possible, of the permissible. But obviously, it is clear that since the Biden administration indicated on numerous occasions that it is more than anxious. It's very eager to move to the negotiation table, to resume negotiation, to re-enter into the Vienna 12-15 aborted agreement, from which Trump left. So obviously it's part of not just saber rattling, but Biden indicated now more than once that actually the Iranian threat is not a threat in his mind or in his perspective. And I would call this evening from an American vantage point, not the Iranian threat, but is there an Iranian threat? Because according to the administration, probably the Saudi threat is much more, is of a bigger magnitude, because most actions, not in terms of rhetoric, but in terms of tangible actions, which Biden initiated so far, were coercive measures not against Iran, but against Saudi Arabia. The suspension of the huge arms deal to the United Emirates and to the Saudi Arabia, basically because of human rights violations, I guess were more punitive and more significant than than what they did to reprimand Salman, the king, for the terrible murder of Khashoggi a couple of years ago. But basically, it's a question of trying to fine-tune, to find a model, to find a perspective which would enable them to accomplish the objective, namely to move jointly on a multilateral level, not bilateral as Trump did, together with the Europeans, together with Russia, with China, and to resume the agreement in two phases, namely, number one, simply to resume, or to reenact the agreement. Number two, to, if possible, to enlarge it, to expand it to the conventional area and to the missiles dimension as well. So basically, it's part of a probing, and the Iranians are playing it tough as usual, since coercive measures initiated by Trump did not establish or did not bring the expected outcome. Now they are obviously recalcitrant, intransigent, and are playing hard to get. This is the beginning of part of the negotiation, coercive negotiation by Iran.
So General Amidor, back to you. You've been dealing with Iran, I believe, for over 3 decades now, maybe more than that, in a direct or indirect way. But since the beginning of the 90s, Iran was in the middle of the scope for Israel, mainly the Iranian nuclear program. And I would not exaggerate by saying that you're one of the top experts in Israel and around the world to the Iranian nuclear program. Looking at that now, give us the pro and cons, and how should we look at it? Because we've heard that the Israeli Prime Minister called for a special meeting a week ago. It was published that you took place as well in that meeting. So obviously, you will not tell us what happened there, but everyone in Israel is very much concerned of the possibility of the Americans returning to the original JCPOA and then leaving all the big holes that were part of it open. So please give us your perspectives on that.
When we speak about the Iranian nuclear program, there are two issues that should be even three. One is the enrichment of the uranium. The agreement allowed the Iranians to have a whole system of enrichment and limited the amount of enriched uranium in Iran, but the system itself was they supposed to continue to have. They had the permission to make all the research and the R&D relating to the next generation of centrifuges, which allow them to enrich and much faster than the previous generation. And so the whole knowledge and the capabilities remained in the hands of the Iranians, and they prepare themselves for the next stage in which they will use the next generation of centrifuges. The weaponization, which is the second issue, is more problematic. Why it is more problematic? Because the Iranians never admitted that they had weaponization efforts in the past, but after the Mossad brought the archive from Tehran to Israel, it is clear that they had something very, very advanced. They were very sophisticated in their efforts. They had big vision, not about one bomb, but more than that. And they hide the archive in a way which can give them the ability to go back to the weaponization stage or efforts immediately. And they kept the know-how by keeping the capsules of experts dealing with issues which are not pure weaponization, but connected to the know-how of weaponization. And no question that the assassination of Fakhrizadeh was a very big setback for them, because he had the whole system in his head, and he was the real expert and responsible for the whole operation. So this is issue number 2, which was very, very how to say it, not to insult anyone, was not dealt directly and in the right way in the agreement. It was neglected by the American experts who led the agreement in 2013 and on. The third issue was not the agreement at all. It's the launching capability. Missiles, and the Iranians did huge step ahead with their capabilities to produce the long-range missiles. My assessment is that they have today the ability to carry nuclear warheads into Europe, not all Europe, but into Europe. And they are advancing their capability. They will have longer and heavier missiles that can take longer range and heavy warheads in the future. And Europe is only the beginning. It will take a few years, and they will have the ability to launch intercontinental missiles into the United States of America. So if you look at all the 3 dimensions of this project, which we begin to speak with the Americans about in 1984-5, and it took us 2 years to convince the Americans that there is an Iranian project. They didn't believe us. You can see that the agreement itself was focused on enrichment with many loopholes, didn't take seriously the weaponization issue, and didn't at all with the delivery systems. So now the Americans have to make decision where they want to be in the next stage. Do they want to go back to the same agreement with all the loopholes, or they want to do something which will be much better?
Yes.
It's an American decision, and we are waiting to their decision.
So both Shira and Professor Ben-Zvi, starting with you, Shira, I want to ask you, what do the Americans and the Europeans want? Because obviously, if I go from go forward from what General Amidror just said, new things were revealed since the original JCPOA, the original agreement in 2015. The main one was the archive that was mentioned. If at 2015 the Iranians said that they told everything, revealed everything, we now know that they lied. They did not do it. They lied to the world. They did not reveal everything. Since 2015, other things were revealed. So obviously, you can be in Washington or in London or in Paris or in Berlin or Moscow or Beijing, the P5+1, but you cannot ignore the facts that are different from 2015. So Shira, starting with you, looking from the West eastbound, what do they want to achieve? Because they cannot ignore the reality.
Okay, so that's a really important question. I just, if it's okay, I want to what Professor Ben-Zvi just said before. I think it's really important, though, to put things in perspective. First of all, we're talking about Saudi Arabia. It's a bigger issue than the Khashoggi killing. I must tell you, I don't know how many people here on the line met Khashoggi. I met him multiple times, including a month before he was brutally assassinated. And when this happened, my colleagues and I, who said to them off the record, said, if this is what you get for these comments, what would real dissidents get? So this is not, it's the straw that broke the back of the camel in U.S. mind. But there was September 11, and then Mohammed bin Salman with a lot of foreign policy adventurism that all failed, with the humiliation of Saad Hariri, with the crisis in the GCC countries. That Qatar, we don't like Qatar for the U.S. perspective. There's the biggest air force in the Middle East there. So I'm just going to say, like, I think we should put the Saudi debate aside on this. On Iran, I must tell you, I was quite surprised. Based on the campaign promises, I thought the Biden administration would already be in negotiations, active negotiations now. We're actually seeing them taking it a little bit more slowly, and this could be for other reasons, for a pandemic, for need to staff people, but I don't see them rushing. And we do need to mention that last week there was an American strike in Syria on Iranian assets. Which I think is an indication that the Americans are trying to say, okay, look, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We are not naive. We don't have any illusions on Iran. We understand that we have to go back to an agreement only to improve it. And Biden himself, and I think Jake Salman said it, they all talk about an agreement that is longer and stronger. In terms of longer, can you extend the sunset provisions, right? Things that are expire, can we stretch these out? And then I think there could be flexibility on this. I'm not sure. We'll see. The Iranians are not showing lots of flexibility at the moment. And then stronger, I think, and again, I'm not in the room where they're talking about the stronger means the region, because there's growing understanding both in Europe and in the United States that the region is key. Whereas the nuclear issue was the number one issue and the negotiations leading up to 2015. I think without dealing with the regional issue, there won't be any solution to Iranian behavior. How do you do that? And this is where the different approaches are, right? Because I think the Americans know what's in the archive. They know what Iran complied with and what it didn't comply with. We need to remember that the problem is, I think the problem from the Biden administration is that the U.S. retired from the agreement. The U.S. withdrew from the agreement, which gave Iran an excuse to do a lot of things. So can you go back to an agreement and hope to improve it? Would Iran be okay with that? And what sorts of leverage the United States can use to ensure that you don't go back to JCPOA 2015 as is, but you get to something more improved. And this is also an important point to say, we know that there were violations in the margins at the beginning. So how does Iran comply with every letter of the JCPOA if you go back to the JCPOA? But how do you improve it also?
Yes, so Professor Ben-Zvi, what do the Americans want?
Well, it's a good question. I think, above all, I think they follow the path or the tradition of even President Kennedy, namely an effort, forgive me for the patronizing name, to tame Iran. Kennedy tried to tame Nasser, to tame a revolutionary regime by integrating it, but by navigating it into a framework of moderation. The idea is that you probably can influence Iran by virtue of conciliation, cooperation, engaging, rather than by coercive measures. That's number one. Number two, we are discussing entirely the nuclear agreement as if it was the only framework in town. Actually, there are the Abraham Accords, and they appear right now to be irreconcilable with American diplomacy, because basically the main payoff for these agreements, the American payoff, was in terms of the, of course, supply of sophisticated weaponry to the Saudi Arabia, to the United Emirates, to Morocco, etc. And that was a kind of compensation for them for crossing the Rubicon and making full peace with Israel. Now this perspective appears to have been abandoned. And everything and the focus is entirely or exclusively on Iran. I think that the administration is less concerned about the technicalities of the nuclear element, but they focus more on the convention, on subversion. Now, how to implement it, how to carry out, how to moderate Iran, that's a main challenge. But I think at least Jake Sullivan, who was one of the architects of the agreement, has some knowledge or some expertise, some experience with how to negotiate with Iran. I think it's a hugely difficult task because it's a circular bargaining. It's not an American kind of ethnocentric negotiation, very direct, very issue directed. It's secular. It's all kinds of deviations, and yes, full of deceptions. And we also have the lesson of North Korea. Full of deception.
Before I move back to General Amidor, I want to ask you a couple of quick questions about what you've said. You've been talking about bringing democracy in large to the Middle East. Well, Barack Obama tried that, and what we received was the Arab Spring, which became a horrible winter. So didn't the administration learn from that anything? And secondly, to that, you've mentioned their negotiation, the previous administration, the Obama administration with the Iranians, they did not do a very good job if we're looking at the JCPOA. So maybe they should try a different approach vis-a-vis the Iranians.
Well, maybe I can try and link together these excellent questions because they basically are predicated on the same premises. I don't think that Americans learn from history, administrations learn from history that much. And I think we should also take into account prevailing sentiments, for example, animosity toward the Trump legacy, namely what Trump did, we can do not just better, but the opposite. And it's not just Obama, it's Carter, the same vision. Carter also should have challenged Iran after the kidnapping of the American hostages at the embassy, and they sent, after a couple of years, 2 helicopters to the desert. So I think Carter, Obama, Biden maybe illustrate or exemplify or different variants of American liberal thinking, which is more optimistic, more willing to take risks and chances. So basically, everything dates back to the same legacy. If you ask me specifically about Obama started his first tenure in Cairo, of course, by apologizing to Iran for, God forbid, for engaging in a coup d'état in August 1953, the overthrowing of Mohammad Mossadegh's regime. And of course, later on, they repudiated Assisi, Egypt's leader, for again orchestrating or concocting a coup d'etat. And I think basically boils down to a basic discrepancy between moral principles and values and realpolitik. And at the beginning of each administration, they are still, I would say, irreversibly committed to a set of idealistic visions which they want to carry out. And obviously, reality is stronger than vision.
Yeah, so General Amidor, back to you, and I'm going to make it tough on you. If my memory does not mistake me, in 2013, where you were still the National Security Advisor, Israel found out that the Americans are talking to the Iranians secretly in Oman, not telling us. I believe you were the person sent to Wendy Sherman at the time to argue her on that. If you were about to be called to President Biden now to convince him off the record why the Americans should not go back to the original JCPOA or should go for a better deal, what would you tell him?
As I said, I think that the 3 dimensions that I mentioned loopholes in the whole issue of enrichment, the lack of detailed constraints on the weaponization and how to monitor it. And third is the missile issue. I think that there are two other problems. One is the sunset. According to the original timetable, within less than 5 years, the agreement is beginning to fade away, and some elements the Iranians can go back to continue with their project with something very new that they didn't in the past. It's legitimacy, because at the end of the agreement, they have the legitimacy to go on with their project, and slowly between 2025 and within another 10 years, the Iranians will have all the legitimacy to go with their project. Second is the issue of when the Americans spoke about the new agreement, they said, yes, we understand the problems, but we build a monitoring system which didn't have any precedence in any country in the past, and this system will work. It doesn't. And if you want to know how much it doesn't, you have to go to Vienna and to ask the guys from the agency, and they are visiting Iran from time to time, and the Iranians do not answer them to their questions. They are now ready to say it.
Okay.
They don't have answers from the Iranians. So these are the 5 areas in which I think the Americans understand that there is a gap between what they promised when they went behind our back to speak with the Iranians and got the agreement, and what is the reality on the ground. And this gap is a huge one, even from the American point of view, leave alone from the Israeli point of view, from the American standard, not Israeli standard. And they have to answer these questions to themselves.
So I want to sum up with a tough question to you, starting with you, Shira, but I would like to get your remarks as well, Professor Ben-Zvi and General Amidor. In Israel, the current perspective is that Iran is the ultimate villain. Iran is responsible for everything. It's the prime problem. And if we solve the Iranian problems, 95% of the problems are solved. Is it true? Are we looking at reality as it should be looked at? Or maybe what Professor Ben-Zvi said a minute ago, maybe the Democratic administration currently in Washington, looking at things more optimistically, maybe is more balanced than us. Maybe we look at things because of our history, far and new history. Maybe we are very much alarming, and we shouldn't be so. Shira, starting with you.
So it's really interesting question, and as you say that, I just got the results of a new Pew Research Center survey that asked Americans, the American public, to rank their foreign policy priorities. They were presented with 20 priorities. Iran is number 13 on their priority. So before that comes climate change and protecting American jobs in China and what have you. So this is also really important, right? Where you sit is where you stand. The priority, the urgency that we attribute to the Iranian issue is nothing of that relevance to the Americans. The Americans has a tendency, a desire to withdraw from the region. It's a long-term trend. Start with Obama, continue with Trump, and it's probably this is the direction that it's going. And we, Israel, whether we want to or not, we are here. On the personal level, maybe as a granddaughter to Holocaust survivors, I don't like the comparison to the Holocaust. I think we're doing, this service to the Holocaust memory. There's no question the Iranian threat is the main threat for Israel. But Israel is the strongest country in this region with the strongest military. And if you think about it, you can reduce the Iranian problem to the Iranian regime, right? there's no problem with the Iranian people. The issue is, however, unlike the other countries in this space, in the region, the Iranians are very capable. It's a very capable adversary, very competent, very smart people. So there's no question that Israel should take it very, very seriously. By the way, I don't take the premise that the Democratic administration is not taking Iran seriously. There's a difference of approach. They're saying, okay, Trump did that, it doesn't work. Let's try a different approach. Israel doesn't have a choice but to take the Iranian threat very, very, very seriously, and it can't afford the U.S. position.
Professor Ben-Zvi?
In an iconoclastic way, actually, you pushed me into it, basically. I think that, first of all, one should not undermine or underestimate the magnitude of the Iranian threat. On the other hand, I think that Iran originally sought nuclear capability in order to project power regionally. For example, to intimidate or to threaten or to deter Saudi Arabia, other forces. Iraq, for example, a couple of decades ago, Israel was not the only or the main target on its horizon. So it was part of its desire to become a major leading regional power. And I think that the nuclear part of the agreement is, well, it sounds acutely threatening to many Israeli leaders, but I think the subversion should be more taken more seriously, because basically the US provided Israel as early as 1998 with kind of a safety net in the Y Accord. The Y Accord was suspended, but to safeguard the existence of Israel in the face of a strategic threat to its existence. So it amounted to a non-conventional deterrence in case of. So I don't think this should be the thrust of Israeli diplomacy. It's basically, it's a war by proxy. It's a low-intensity conflict, and it's a kind of, it's perpetual. It's in Syria, it's in Iraq, it's in Lebanon, and these are the issues, basically the main threats and challenges to Israel's security. And the nuclear threat exists, but we should see it in perspective. I see it as the impotence of an omnipotence, but it's I doubt whether it's feasible, it's workable, whether it's a matter of a couple of months or a year or a couple of years.
Yes.
This is part of the thrust of this Iranian threat, as far as I see.
General Amidror, last word from you. Looking at Iran, the ultimate villain.
I'll answer the question in another way. If tomorrow morning the threat of Iran disappear from the reality, it doesn't matter why, a change of regime, because the Iranians will decide to focus inside and not to spread the revolution all over the Middle East. Take the Middle East as it is today, and if you take Iran threat from the equation, no question that the situation of Israel will be much, much better. And I, with all due respect, are not ready to take the chance that the Iranian regime will have nuclear capability. And based on my assessment, that may be or probably it will not be used. My advice to any decision maker in Israel: don't let the Iranians to have nuclear capability, because no one can guarantee how they will behave and what they will do with this capability if they have it.
So I want to thank you all, Dr. Shira Efron, Professor Avi Ben-Zvi, General Jacob Amidror. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you, all of our audience all over the US, for being with us. I believe Iran will be with us for a long, long time, so I'm sure we'll have many other opportunities to be part of such meetings. Thank you all, and have a great day and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much for hosting us.